the Cold War and the process of global decolonization from 1945 until 1975, a time period that would be dominated by the two superpowers, that being the United States of America and the United Social Soviet Republic, the USSR. One side was communist, the other side was capitalist democratic. This is a fairly large topic, and so you may need to take a few pauses along the way. As you can see from the time period, we are going to be looking at quite a few decades of the decolonization and how that affects with the superpowers influence, as well as what was happening and the role that the United Nations had with the process of decolonization, along with the legacy of the League of Nations and the importance of human rights. This is arguably the biggest topic that we will look at with this third unit. That being said, too, some of the objectives of why we did this and why the previous topic was the case study of the Suez Canal was first to understand the causes of the Cold War as with its political and environmental consequences in Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, along with the two superpowers. It is also important with your critical thinking to understand the process of decolonization and how to analyze the variations of this. You also want to understand the challenges of nation building and compare that to the problems of developing countries, and also analyze the reasons for the various ways why the third world countries, China, Japan, and Middle East, were both affected and were taken advantage of in the Cold War. As we were looking at the Suez Canal crisis with the 6 different points of view, the Middle East in particular had been influenced by 3 main European philosophies: colonialism, then capitalism, and then communism, the 3 C's. And while we're studying this, we will keep a little bit of a perspective on the United States during the Cold War. And the reason for us going to focus a little more on the United States is because currently the United States is the only superpower currently on the world. China might become a superpower someday, but currently China does not have a true blue water navy capabilities, and there are various internal political issues that is harming its overall growth to become a superpower. As an example of China, there is no professional sports leagues such as hockey or NFL, baseball, or soccer yet. The thing about the Cold War was the idiocy, the chaos of nuclear Armageddon, the genie of its sorts being let out of the bottle when the first atomic bomb was tested. But also in the Cold War, it was that race of domination between the two superpowers. As you see in this political cartoon, you have Brezhnev on the left side with the Soviets and Kennedy on the right side, both in that struggle of who would blink first. One of the most serious times that happened in the Cold War crisis was the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was also the arms race between both sides, that being the Americans and the Soviets, of just building up larger and larger armies, navies, and air forces. There's also the stockpile of nuclear weaponry by both superpowers, but yet they would fight each other in proxy wars using weaponry that was well below their capabilities. There was also the domino theory from the United States, where if one place would go communist, place being country, then another would become like that domino effect, whether it was with Turkey or Greece or the war in Korea, Vietnam. It was with the domino theory, the whole theory of containment, of containing the spread of communism from an American point of view, will lead to those various proxy wars. Proxy wars where the superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union do not fight each other directly, because that would actually be open war, but they would fight each other indirectly. In countries such as Korea, Vietnam, Angola, and Afghanistan. There was many more, about over 20, but those are a few that people are the most familiar with. And then when I think about these proxy wars, I think of it as an analogy such as this. In these proxy wars, imagine these are giants in the playground. The giants are in the sandbox and they're kicking up the sand against each other. The sand being these other countries that they are fighting each other indirectly with. And with these proxy wars, as you see in this map, um, everything red was communist controlled. Though note, it does not include China. China, the People's Republic, had been established. They were communists. In fact, actually, the Chinese and the Soviets were almost at war with each other, and there was various border skirmishes between the two powers. Everything blue was allied with the United States along with the NATO countries of Western Europe there. And these same colors you see in the legend represent major military bases or command bases or missile batteries by both sides. But the main point of this map is to show you every location where the proxy conflicts would take place between the two powers there. Plus, also, you spend more time carefully analyzing what you see in this map. Remember, back in the very first week, we studied, how to analyze primary sources and the whole fake news. Maps, once again, you can learn so much on these kind of maps. And by studying these maps, you can see where the countries need to do their defenses from, like North America with the distance early warning line, those stations up in the Canadian Arctic, or the radar line in the United States, to where the Soviets had planted most of their military bases, that being along the southern borders with the Central Asian countries or throughout the Eastern Europe or the Warsaw Pact countries. But to finish off the look at this map, you can definitely tell the scope and size of the superpowers and how they use the proxy conflicts or proxy wars to assert dominance over everyone else in the world. Now, if you're wondering how does this relate to the current unit, let's get into that with the United Nations. After World War II, the Allies saw the Soviet Union as a center of world revolutionary movement, while the Soviets felt they were surrounded by the Western countries and their alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which was founded in 1949. The United Nations provided a venue for face-to-face debate between the two sides in the Cold War, which did mark a substantial change between the United Nations and the League of Nations, because the League did not include certain key members when the League was established, but the UN did. Essentially, too, the UN has established in 1945 with a General Assembly, Security Council, full-time bureaucracy headed by the Secretary General, as well as various special agencies. Essentially, all were signatories of the Charter for the UN. And the UN Charter, it renounced war. It renounced territorial conflict and conquest. But in practice, the UN was not always able to forestall or quell international conflicts. As an example, the decolonization of Africa and Asia greatly swelled the size of the General Assembly, swelling more and more countries would join the General Assembly, which became an arena for expressing opinions and whose resolutions carried great weight in the early years of the UN. With the influx of these new members, it made the General Assembly more concerned with poverty or racial discrimination and the struggle against imperialism, that being the European powers such as Britain or France. Um, and so the Western powers would start to ignore the General Assembly more and more as it became this really large, loud, bureaucratic venue that was already starting to grow beyond its original mandate and purpose. While at the same time, in the United Nations General Assembly, there was essentially a divide of capitalism versus communism. From 1944 to 46, Western capitalist countries created a new international monetary system in which supply and demand prices that were included a system of exchange rate by the IMF and the World bank. Essentially, with the capitalism, the world currency became dominated by the American dollar. Because of that, the USSR became suspicious of Western intentions and establishing of a closed monetary system in which a state would allocate goods and set prices for itself. And therefore, communist states of Eastern Europe there is always like that cause and effect. If you do this, I will do this as well. You actually see the similar kind of plans going on today, but of course it's not with the Soviet Union. That's Russia now, is now what's happening in America or what is being done in China. But with the United States economy recovered and prospered after World War II, the economy of Western Europe, while heavily damaged by the World War II, did recover relatively well because of the aid provided by the American Marshall Plan, the financing of the reconstruction of Europe. While US and Europe sought to increase their role in economic management during the time in 1940, Europeans initiated a process of cooperation, integration with the Organization of the European Economic Cooperation. Essentially, this point is a precursor to the establishing of what we now know as the European Union. There, and as it expanded, whether it's the developing of the European Economic Community or the Common Market or the European Community, Western Europe was rebuilding, getting more advanced, getting more money, more wealth faster than the Eastern European side there. And the Soviet Union and the Eastern European states relied on the government to determine the production, distribution, or the price of goods. The communist states, the recovery from World War II was rapid at first, but a long-term run, though, the Soviets and Eastern European countries were not able to match what was being done in the West, especially when it came to consumer goods, housing, and food. And if you think about this in a big picture, why this is important is because if you ever travel to Europe today, which I highly recommend all of you should travel to Europe at least once in your lifetime and see the place, you can really see the example of that difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. As an example, just in the countries such as Germany, Germany had been split into West Germany and East Germany, East being communist and the West Germany being the democratic capitalist. And even today, in recent years, the German government, Angela Merkel, tries to encourage if you live in West Germany, you should move to East Germany. If you lived in East Germany, you should move to West Germany. People on both sides should actually try to marry someone on the other side. Even like their demographic profile in the Germany today, you can see difference of the level of education or even the money that the families make there. It is pretty that the scars or the depth of how this capitalism versus communism, the Soviets or the Americans, you can still see these lingering leftovers of these policies from decades in the past. And Germany is a fascinating example because arguably the European Union now exists only because of the power of Germany's economy. Now, if that was enough with the capitalism versus communism, there was this also divide of West versus East, whether you're looking in geographical areas such as Europe or the smaller example, but very important to ongoing political issues today of Korea. With the establishment, the rapid establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, that led the United States to see the USSR as a world enemy. And the Americans' perception, led by the Truman Doctrine, Henry Truman, the president of 1947, and establishment of NATO. The USSR, the Soviet Union, also organized a similar institution called the Warsaw Pact, where after the Western powers allowed West Germany to rearm within the limits set by NATO. And by West Germany rearming itself to join NATO, East Germany would sort of rearm itself, but East Germany would really become this incredible police state. If you can think about it, communism has a pretty potent police apparatus. Now, if you merge a police state of a communist country along with the leftover expertise of Nazism, you can just imagine just how potent of a police force and a police state would be formed by these two former adversaries. Now, after the third great, if there was a third great war, did not break out in Europe, but the Soviet Union and the West did test each other's resolve in instances such as the blockade of West Berlin, the construction of the Berlin or the Berlin Wall, the West's encouragement of a rift between the Soviets and Yugoslavia, the Soviet power in places like Hungary or Czechoslovakia, or in Korea, where the American and Soviet occupation zones in the north and south of the 38th parallel led to the establishment of North Korea and South Korea. By 1948, communist countries such as North Korea and non-communist South Korea would go to war, which would pull China and America and NATO and also the United Nations into a conflict which is actually not technically resolved there. No peace treaty has ever been signed between the two sides. So with the United States too, was it defeated or was it a draw in Vietnam? After winning independence from France, the people of Vietnam, communist North Vietnam supported a guerrilla warfare of communists called the Viet Cong against the non-communist government in South Vietnam. The American president, John F. Kennedy, decided to send American military advisors to assist South Vietnam, and President Lyndon Johnson gained congressional support for unlimited expansion of the U.S. military deployment. Unable, though, to stop the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies, the Americans did end its involvement in Vietnam in 1973. But the Vietnam War did bring significant casualties to both sides and gave rise to serious economic problems and even more, an anti-war movement in the United States. Vietnam is definitely something that still exists in the culture and the psyche of the Americans today. And if that was enough, there was also the race for nuclear supremacy. With the existence of weapons of mass destruction, this affected all aspects of the Cold War confrontation, causing paranoia, spreading the fear of nuclear destruction throughout the war. The fear of nuclear war seemed to be realized when the Soviets deployed nuclear missiles to the country of Cuba, which precipitated the Cuban Missile Crisis, but Khrushchev did back down. But that means the delivery, the destructive force, would be very expensive and arduous process. And rather than attempting to keep up with the expensive arms race, European countries sought to relax tensions between East and West, creating such organizations such the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is kind of led to the whole Helsinki Accords. And from the whole nuclear arms race led to the whole space race and the space exploration, with the first human-made object being sent into space being referred to as Sputnik. Once again, you have all these big events happening. Of course, because the Suez Canal crisis. At the same time, there was the United Nations with the human rights and the General Assembly, and that is how we come to this point, decolonization. The decolonization, where you see on this map, you see there was essentially 8 powers, the eighth one being essentially someone else, but they were being either Britain, France, Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, Portugal, or the United States. These places, one by one, becoming independent. As they become independent, these countries would want to become members of the United Nations. By being a member of the United Nations, it would really help to legitimize their independence status and to begin leaving behind their history of colonialism. And you can see on this map, each one of these countries, there's also a year when they gained their independence. So there was this tremendous global reshuffling that took place within the United Nations and the role the United Nations had. But at the same time, you have these 2 superpowers that had their own interests and their own agendas at play. Um, and also, if you recall back in our very first topic of the overall structure of the United Nations, the Trustee Councilship, that was the 6th and final organ of the United Nations, and this is why it had been created. So, with the decolonization and state building, new nations in South and Southeast Asia to start. After partition, 1947, independent states such as India, Pakistan were strikingly dissimilar with each other there. And actually, the borders of these 2 countries were largely drawn up by the British, which created the whole situation why Kashmir is essentially disputed territory between 2 nuclear-armed countries today. But Pakistan defended itself in terms of religion and fell under military control leaders, and saw itself as the Bengali-speaking section that ceded and to become an independent nation of Bangladesh in 1971. However, India was a secular republic with a 90% Hindu population and inherited a larger share of the industrial and educational resources that had been left behind by the former British Empire, and was able to maintain unity despite its substantial linguistic heterogeneity there. And in the Southeast Asia, the effects of the Japanese inflicted on the British, the French, and Dutch forces because of the war in the Pacific, i.e., World War II, is an example to people of Asia of how they can stand up to European colonial powers. And so in the years after, or also known as the post-war period, various national movements like Gandhi, these national movements led to the independence of Indonesia, Burma, Malay Federation, as well as the Philippines by 1946. There actually, a side note, this past couple of weeks, I've been learning lots about, for my cell phone, and just about the history of the Philippines. And I actually find the history of the Philippines to be a fascinating example of history of religious movements as well as nationalist movements mixed in with imperialism of different colonial powers there. But going back to the second point with India and Pakistan, and how India inherited a larger scale of the industrial and educational resources, India definitely is on the path to become a pretty substantial regional power, which does put Pakistan into a very unique geopolitical position of which country would they be more friendly towards? Would Pakistan be more friendly towards the United States, or would Pakistan be more friendly towards China? Both have advantages and consequences to India's ongoing um, growth as a regional power in the South Asia South Asia theater. Now, with the struggle for independence in Africa, the post-war French government granted independence to locations such as Tunisia and Morocco, but was determined to hold on to Algeria. It has essential French settlers and populations and vineyards and oil and gas fields there. But the French-Algerian revolt that broke out in 1954 was pursued with great brutality on both sides, but the French did withdraw by 1962. Well, same time the whole Suez Canal crisis was happening. France actually has a very fascinating and a deep, long history of, let's just say, interest in North Africa from a geopolitical point of view. However, none of these civil wars of independence in the Saharan Africa match to the Algerian scale for a struggle. But even without war, these new states suffered from a variety of problems, including these arbitrary drawn borders, over dependence of export crops, a lack of networks, and over populations. It was this leftover mess. But yet, these places would all want to become members of the United Nations to make, which will just make that General Assembly even bigger and bigger and bigger there. And while this is all happening, there were there's another variation or filter you want to put on, which is the struggle for independence in Africa, where the African leaders in sub-Saharan French colonies were reluctant to call for independence because they realized that some of the colonies had a very bleak, not optimistic economic prosperity in their future, and they were aware of the importance of the billions and billions of dollars that was coming from the investments of France. Now, as the French colonies did achieve their independence between 1958 and 1960, but then they fell into that economic disparity, the developing world status, or countries that were just heavily indebted poor countries. Decolonization of Africa was often resolved in struggles because people of European descent fought against the indigenous Africans to attempt to regain their personal privileges or resources or political power, and the race of conflict was particularly severe in the southern part of Africa, including the former Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, or the British colony of Southern Rhodesia, i.e., Zimbabwe, or Southwest Africa, or actually South Africa, where some of you did your research on the whole apartheid and the ongoing situation that had happened in South Africa. Really, when you look at this struggle for the independence for Africa, it was one struggle of leaving behind the colonials, of being a colony to Western Europe, but now old issues, old tensions, old whatever happened in the past would resurface once again. And now today in the 2020, China is actually making a lot of inroads, whether it's through the One Belt, One Road initiative or other programs, to kind of gain a lot more control and, let's just say, financial influence throughout Africa to support the ongoing growing power of the People's Republic of China. Now but the story of Africa is also arguably the most complicated histories to understand. Now, if that's what's also going on in Africa, there was the quest for economic freedom in Latin America, where in Latin America, the independence from European rule was achieved earlier by American European economic domination did not decrease and actually increase, such as in Mexico, the revolutionary rhetoric by the ruling Revolutionist Party was accompanied by a large, persistent disparity between rich and poor, rural versus urban. Or in Guatemala, the president Huaco Abres Gomez attempted to expropriate the large landowners, including a fruit company, there, which prompted the American CIA to assist the military coup that removed the government there, which precipitated decades of political instability and violence there. Or in the 1950s, a Cuban leader, Batista, presented over a corrupt, repressive regime, while the United States and a small class of wealthy Cubans dominated the economy. But when 1959, when soon to be a very popular leader, Fidel Castro, led a communist revolution that forced Batista to leave the country, redistribute the land, lower the rents, raise wages, seize property of U.S. and Cuban um, corporations there. But yet there's still little various evidence that Castro undertook to stall a communist government, but did force, he did face a U.S. military blockade, and then the whole Bay of Pigs, and then the whole Cuban Missile Crisis. Kind of like what was done back in the Suez Canal. You have one location, but if you start peeling back the layers, you can start seeing so much more interest in geopolitics and leftover colonial history and self-interest, and you just can just keep on digging to what you want to find out. And of course, in this map here, it was an example of what had happened in the Suez Canal crisis or the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli settlers. They're essentially, it was what's called the bipolar world, or what we used to be referred to as the third world. That we don't use the term third world, we use the term developing nations. But like in 1959, the president of Indonesia hosted a meeting of 29 African Asia countries there, and this meeting marked the beginning of an effort by many new, poor, former non-European nations to emerging from the leftovers legacy, the shackles of colonialism, to gain more weight in the world. And these leaders, called the third world countries, preferred to label the non-aligned because of the movement had sympathy towards the Soviet Union for it. And an example of this was the Egyptian leader like Nasser or Sadat, to play both superpowers for it. So once again, you have these different layers. You have these new countries that first began to exist. The next layer is the United Nations, that is relatively new still, but with the councils and organization, the human rights of all the bureaucracy and everything's going to the UN. And then you put the very top layer being the two superpowers. And I suppose you even put like a fourth layer, which is countries such as Canada that really try to act like the middle power, whereas Canada or Australia trying to be the neutral kind of power, but still being very much aligned with one of the super powers. This is geopolitics. Or with Japan and China. Both Japan and China were able to keep advantage of superpower preoccupation in the Cold War, but the American occupation of Japan gave a constitution that allowed the country to only limit itself to self-defense and ban the deployment of Japanese troops abroad. Japanese stayed out of the Cold War and concentrated on building up on their industries and emerging in the emerging world of commerce, and eventually developing new markets in Southeast Asia. And the Japanese government was actually aided by Japanese business in developing the three industries that would be so critical to the Japanese emergence as an economic superpower. And those would be electricity, steel, and shipbuilding. Whereas in China, that was still deeply involved in Cold War politics, yes, but they were being allied and receiving aid from the Soviet Union. But the People's Republic in China, Soviet Union began to diverge in different directions by 1956 as Chairman Mao Zedong introduced his own radical policies that would lead to the disastrous and Great Leap Forward, or the Cultural Revolution, and the rift. The rift between the Soviets and the Chinese became so big, so severe, that even the American president, Richard Nixon, sought to establish cooperative relationship with China by the 1970s, because the rift between these two communist countries was so deep that this rift would actually be an advantage to the Americans there. Because also remember, in the United Nations, in the Security Council, remember in the Security Council there are 5 permanent members: Britain, France, yes, but America, Soviets, and the Chinese were the other 5, are the 5 permanent members, those members of the superpowers. it's chess. Like it really is a game of chess. Or in the Middle East, the Arab states were slowly gaining independence in the post-war years, and the struggle with Israel became to overshadow all of the politics of the Middle East, as we learned with that case study about the Suez Canal. However, after World War II, immense pressure to resettle European Jewish refugees forced Britain to turn to Palestine, and the question was led to the United Nations General Assembly, where the General Assembly voted in 1947, November, to partition Palestine into two states. One state would be for the Jewish, the other state would be for the Arabs, the Palestinians. Israel declares independence in May 1948 and defeated the Palestinian and other Arab forces that attempted to crush the newborn state. In the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel took up Arab lands, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula there, which led to the Palestinian Liberation Army, the PLO, headed by Yasser Arafat, to wage a guerrilla war against Israel and other acts of terrorism. We really don't have a lot of time in the course to explore, but if you take History 12, you will learn lots more about what had happened in that little portion of the world from the Yom Kippur War. It's well, the situation is still not resolved. And because of growing demand for oil in the post-war era, prompting various Arab states to emerge, they formed OPEC in 1960, and OPEC basically became this major, powerful organization for oil. Even today, what happened in the Middle East in the post-war eras, the post-colonial time, for oil, global oil, it's OPEC or Russia, or even the United States too now are some of the major oil producers. And then with the oil though, of course, brings these environmental concerns, the emergence of environmental concerns. The Cold War and the tremendous economic recovery focus on public and government attention on technological innovation and enormous industrial projects. Student protests in the United States, France, Japan, Mexico represent the growth of youth activism that's focused on environmental problems, of which we still see, of course, going on today. So, how to wrap this all up? Because, like I said, this is a really big kind of a topic. I did include some ideas or thoughts that some of you did talk about in your first research paper. It's just so you can, for some of you, so you can really help to understand the bigger picture. But the Cold War tactics of the Soviet Union and the United States, both countries attempted to influence two governments formerly occupied by the Axis powers. Both tried to establish military alliances against each other, while both sides saw the conflict emerge coming from irreconcilable differences in both social and economic systems, that being capitalist or communist. Each also emphasized the corruption, injustice, and unfairness towards the other, i.e., the use of propaganda. Through real combat between the United States and Soviet Union did not materialize, but it was played on distant civil wars or regional conflicts, which was supported by the two superpowers, and that was these proxy war conflicts that were happening between these countries that all were gaining their independence one by one, and these countries are gaining their independence would become members of the United Nations General Assembly. Some of these countries will also become members from time to time on the UN Security Council. I hope you can start to see the level of international politics is pretty substantial for it. And with the Cold War form of nationalism, nationalism played a major role after World War II in desire for the colonized peoples to gain their independence, obscuring the contest between the main component or opponents of the Cold War, i.e., that's the three layers: superpower, then United Nations General Assembly, and then what was referred to originally as the third world countries or everyone else there. And some long-time colonial powers such as India were getting to their independence, where similar sentiments in China led to overthrow of elite governments seen as weak relations with Western powers, whereas many of the independence movements of Africa or Middle East or Caribbean operated as traditional struggles for the sovereignty, but yet in Latin America, these nations had already gained their independence, and the desire was for economic independence and an end to foreign intervention. But independent movements such as Korea and Vietnam that would arise because of the ending of the Japanese, the Imperial Japan's control. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the communists, China supported these communist forces in those regions, which will bring the United States to commit larger military forces to protect the anti-government or the anti-communist forces because of like the domino effect, the containment policies. So wrapping this all up, when we started this all again, we looked at first the structure of the United Nations, then the history of the League of Nations, and then to human rights before we started all this. These are case studies. Hopefully, from this lecture, you have an understanding of various of geopolitics that have happened since the end of World War II, and how the United Nations was involved, but the United Nations essentially became the arena for the giants' playground, the giants' sandbox in the time of Cold War and the process of decolonization. I would recommend if any of the locations that are mentioned in the notes today, please go ahead and research more about it there. That could be definitely useful in your upcoming second research paper.